Hello and welcome to the Irish History Podcast. My name is Finn Dwyer, and this is episode 6, The Decline of the O'Neills. Today we continue a journey we started in episode 5 through 10th century Ireland. An island that, as we saw in previous episodes, was being ripped apart by war and violence. This journey will see Ireland, and indeed Gaelic society as a whole, turned on its head through the 10th century, in an epic story of the ruthless pursuit of power. To begin today, we'll have a quick recap on what's happened so far, and then we'll start a journey where we'll encounter some of the greatest characters in medieval Irish history. Over the past few episodes, we saw Gaelic Ireland struggling to deal with the Viking onslaught, as life became frighteningly cheap. Society was increasingly dominated by aggressive, violent men. In what at times seemed like a never-ending cycle of violence, one kingdom, the O'Neills, grew in power, and in 908, under their High King, Flann Cinna, they landed a devastating blow on their old enemy, the O'Gornacht Kingdom of Munster. It was after this victory that the O'Neills seemed on their way to dominating the entire island. But before they could take advantage of their great victory, the Vikings returned after a decade in exile and launched a series of devastating raids and attacks on Ireland, destabilising the entire country. At the end of episode 5, the O'Neills themselves were trying to recover from a major defeat they suffered at the hands of the Vikings in 919 that saw the High King Niall Glundubh killed. We pick up the story today as the O'Neills select their third High King in as many years, a man who will have to try and recover the kingdom's prestige after its savage defeat in 919. The future was uncertain, with everything to play for. In 919, when the O'Neill High King Niall Glundubh was killed in battle against the Vikings, he was succeeded by a man called Donnacha Dun Mac Flann, or in English, Dark Donnacha, son of Flann. As his name suggests, he was the son of the great High King, Flann Cinna. Donnacha must have been one of those people that felt the weight of massive expectation on his shoulders. His father was Flann Cinna, and his grandfather was Muir Shocknall, both legendary High Kings amongst the O'Neills. So you can just about imagine what people would have expected from Donnacha. He had a hell of a lot to live up to. When Donnacha became king, he faced an uncertain future, but not one necessarily without possibilities. Donnacha was relatively young, and with the prospect of a long rule ahead of him, he had plenty of time to replicate the actions of his forefathers. Although he faced a somewhat chaotic situation since the Vikings had returned, for an ambitious man, he had a good chance of forging order from the chaos. Of all the kings on the island, this young king Donnacha was probably in the best position, as he was ruling over the largest and most powerful kingdom. As he looked around him in 919, there was no insurmountable problems. Even though the Vikings had killed his predecessor, and they had the potential to become a serious problem, soon enough it became obvious that they were mainly focused on gaining power in England, and should Donnacha make a concerted effort against them, he would have had a good chance of victory. In the early days of his reign, Donnacha probably harboured hopes of building on his father Flann Cinna's great victory over the O'Gornacht and push O'Neill power into Munster. But before he could ever think of expansion, he had problems to deal with at home. These were the same problems that every O'Neill High King had to deal with. You see, as High King, they ruled over two kingdoms, the Northern and Southern O'Neills. The Northern O'Neill Kingdom was dominated by a family called the Cinna alone, while the Southern O'Neill Kingdom was dominated by Donnacha's family, the Clan Coleman. These two families rotated the position of High Kingship between them, and for 200 years they had excluded the many other branches of the O'Neill family. But when Donnacha took power, this arrangement was getting shaky. Donnacha needed to watch his back as such. Before he could ever think of expansion, he needed to confirm the loyalty, or at least his supremacy, over the Northern O'Neills. In 919, Donnacha got his rule off to a good start. A measure of an effective medieval king was his ruthlessness, and in his first 3 years in office, Donnacha showed he was as ruthless as the best of them. He eliminated remaining opposition around him in the Southern O'Neills. He blinded one of his brothers and killed another brother, Donal, just to safeguard his rule. For people looking on, while it may sound very strange to us, he was kind of showing potential. In 920, he followed this up by defeating the Vikings in battle. Hopes must have been high. However, through the 920s, Donogh didn't really take advantage of his early successes. All glory, in fact, was being taken by the people Donogh was supposed to be controlling, the Northern O'Neills. Through the 920s, the Northern O'Neills, over whom Donogh had never really expressed authority, defeated the Vikings on 3 occasions, once in 921 and then twice in 926. These defeats seriously damaged the Vikings, eliminating them as a serious threat for a few decades anyway, and gave Donogh one less thing to worry about. But, hidden in this victory was a far greater problem for Donogh than the Vikings could ever be. This came in the shape of the Northern O'Neills' military leader. Next we'll see who this man was. The Northern O'Neills' military leader was a man called Murtough Mac Neil. Heir to the kingdom, his brother was actually the reigning king. He was the son of the previous High King, Niall Glundubh, and from the accounts of his exploits in the 920s, he really comes across as a role model for any warrior. Indeed, when he would die, he would be eulogised as the Hector of the West. He spent much of the 920s in battle, reinforcing the dominant position of the Canailone amongst the Northern O'Neills. As with any hero of the time, Murtough was as brutal as he was brilliant. But this was part of the course. For Donogh, however, this man could become a problem. Murtough would eventually become king of the Northern O'Neills, and then he would be Donogh's successor under the strange O'Neill system. But it was clear Murtough was ambitious and could easily become a threat to Donogh's rule if he wasn't willing to wait for Donogh to die to succeed him. It was clear for Donogh he needed to control the Northern O'Neills soon if he was ever to be a successful king. In 927, Donogh was presented the perfect chance. That year, Donogh held a gathering called the Fair of Taltu. This was an assembly of the powerful families of the O'Neills, when they gathered at the royal site of Tara. The event had been far more important in earlier Irish history, and by the 10th century it had become an expression of a High King's power. You can imagine this as being something akin to modern-day political party rallies. There was obviously no TV at the time, so this was kind of the equivalent of a showcase in power, where the High King was sending out a message about who was boss. Clearly it was an important event for Donogh. However, it was at this event he faced his first major challenge. What exactly happened isn't clear, but Murtough Mac Neil either tried to stop the event happening or challenged Donogh to battle at the fair. Now, although direct confrontation was avoided, this was a major affront to Donogh's rule. There was no question that this was bad for Donogh. He was king, and he could not accept such a challenge to his authority, especially from a man who was not even a king yet. He had just been called out in front of what were the major families in his kingdom, and in a society where physical force was so important, he could not allow someone to challenge him, or else his great show of strength could easily become a show of weakness. Donogh surely had to act. He needed to re-emphasise his authority. But amazingly, he did nothing. There was no major military campaign or no assassination of Murtough. For Donogh's supporters and admirers, this should have set alarm bells ringing. Now 2 years later, in 929, he did attack Murtough, but the encounter seems to have been indecisive. And as we will see, Donogh was never able to gain control over his rival. This fear, failure, or inability to control Murtough would haunt him for the rest of his life. Worries people may have had after his relative inactivity through the 920s should have been confirmed by this. It was becoming clear Donogh would struggle as High King. It seems the early actions of mutilating and killing his brothers were probably the most decisive thing Donogh ever did. Donogh would struggle to ever control the northern branch of the family. Indeed, he would really live in their shadow, and the shadow of one man in particular, Murtough Mac Neil. It seems the gene that had made Donogha's father, Flann Sinna, and his grandfather, Muel Shocknell, great high kings, skipped poor Donogha. He was the most ineffective, procrastinating O'Neill high king since reliable histories began in the late 8th century. In the years after the incident at the Fair of Taltu, Donogha never really gained the supremacy he needed to be high king. Because of this, he could not expand the power of the O'Neills. Indeed, if anything, their influence was getting less and less. For Donogha, he was presumably far more worried about the day when Murtough Mac Neil would rise to power amongst the Northern O'Neills. In 937, the day of reckoning finally arrived. Murtaugh's wait was over. He was now king of the Northern O'Neills, and he must have looked at Donogha, who, as high king, was technically his superior, with great disdain. These two men were like chalk and cheese. Murtough, the quintessential man of action, solved his problems with a sword. You can just imagine how he felt about the situation. He was the king of the Northern O'Neills, but because of some old custom, he was supposed to be subordinate to a man like Donogha. It was intolerable. It seems there was inevitably going to be a conflict. For Donogha, he must have known that he was now facing into a conflict against a man with an army of veterans from his numerous wars against the Vikings and enemies within the Northern O'Neills. Donogha's chances of victory were slim. As 937 gave way to 938, Murtough made his move. The exact details are not handed down in the annals. All we are told is Donogha, son of Flann, and Murtough, son of Niall, made preparations for battle. However, given Donogha's track record and his slim chances of victory, it's pretty unlikely he provoked the conflict. There were multiple reasons why Murtough would have wanted to fight Donogha. His inept rule was impacting on the overall power and prestige of the O'Neill family. Just as the O'Neills prepared for an all-out civil war, the annals tell us, God brought them to peace. That peace should emerge where war was possible is pretty unusual for Gaelic Ireland. But we can assume that God may have pointed out the destructive nature of the war, and that Donogha and Murtough had in fact common enemies elsewhere. They appear to have agreed a treaty of sorts, which would see the O'Neills engage on an aggressive policy of expansion. Peace between these two meant a frantic 3 years of war and destruction for everyone else. This new situation obviously suited Murtough. He had come off the best. Because his physical confrontation became the name of the game, Donogha began to fade in influence and power, as the battle-hardened Murtaugh's star just rose and rose. He could take comfort in the knowledge that all gains would come to him as he was going to succeed Donogha. In 938, Murtough and Donogha began expanding the influence of the O'Neills when they sacked the Viking settlement at Dublin and a small territory the Vikings had carved out around it. This was in response to a raid on the monastery at Kilcullen earlier that year, but it was also a demonstration of what was coming down the line to anyone who was going to dare stand up to the O'Neills. The rest of Ireland must have waited with bated breath to see what the following year would bring. However, 939 brought the most unexpected of events, when suddenly the advance of the O'Neills ground to a halt, when the Vikings showed they wouldn't lie down easily. The Vikings, campaigning in Ireland and Britain, had grown increasingly weaker through the 10th century. They had focused all their energies on England for 2 decades and then had suffered a crushing defeat at Brunanburh at the hands of the Anglo-Saxons in 937. So, 2 years later, it must have shocked everyone when the Vikings from the Hebrides, islands off the coast of Scotland, launched a daring naval raid on the kingdom of Aileach, homeland of the Cynhalion and Murtough. Amazingly, they were also able to kidnap Murtough in this raid. For Murtough himself, taken on a Viking longship, it must have seemed like he was a dead man. He had fallen into the hands of the enemy and could expect nothing less than death. The Vikings now had a chance to land a significant blow against the O'Neills by killing Murtough. But, ever the astute businessmen, it seems the Vikings ransomed him back. No matter how much wealth they got for his ransom, the phrase short-term gain for long-term pain springs to mind. These Vikings would personally live to regret this. In 940, Murtough and Donogh went on another campaign, but unsurprisingly they decided to leave the Vikings in Dublin well enough alone. They instead headed into Leinster and Munster, forcing submission in both provinces, and were able to return north after what had seemed to have been a relatively uneventful campaign. This, however, was just the calm before the storm, because the following year Murtough brought the O'Neills to the verge of being complete overlords in Ireland. The year began as Murtough decided to expand the power of the O'Neills further into Munster by attacking small territories on the periphery of the kingdom. This was where the war really got messy. Murtough and an army of the O'Neills attacked the small territory of the Daoise, who lived in modern-day County Waterford on the south coast. The Daoise were in no way able to stand up to the immense military power of the O'Neills, and Murtough brutally forced submission. According to the annals of the Four Masters, he totally plundered and ravaged the entire country, so that they, the inhabitants, submitted to him. After what was a short, if brutal campaign, Murtough left his new territories and returned north to the kingdom of the O'Neills. He had way bigger plans for later in the year. For the Daoise, though, they must have known their submission spelled serious trouble. You see, before Murtough ever arrived on the scene, the Daoise had been ruled by Ceallachain, the king of Munster, and he was furious when he discovered that they had submitted to someone other than him, even if they had had little choice in the matter. As the Daoise struggled to recover from Murtough's violent attack, they knew they could expect retribution from Ceallachain. Indeed, those burying the dead could expect to join them. Later, in the same year of 940, Ceallachain vented his fury. According to the annals of the Four Masters, a slaughter was made of the Daoise by Ceallachain and the men of Munster, because they had submitted to Murtough, son of Niall, and he slew 2,000 of them. For the Daoise, they were caught between a rock and a hard place. As the O'Neills expanded south, Ceallachain, the king of Munster, was attempting to maintain his power, and they were caught in the middle. This was the reality of daily life in medieval Ireland, where individual people's lives were eaten up in a horrific game of power politics. While Ceallachain was attacking the Daoise for submitting to Murtough, Murtough himself was busy gaining vengeance for his kidnapping in 938, and also showing his skills as a military tactician. For a century and a half, the Vikings' major advantage had been that they could launch naval raids, hitting in unsuspecting locations, and then being gone before defence could be organised. Murtough, however, learned from this, and later in 941 he launched a stunning naval raid on the Viking bases of the Hebrides, in retribution for the kidnapping of him 3 years earlier. This raid must have shocked the Vikings. It must have been so strange. They had, after all, controlled the seas for most of the 9th and 10th century. This was their great military advantage, and now it was being used against them. Their era of domination was being challenged. Indeed, it was coming to an end. After this raid, Murtough returned to Ireland to hear the news that Ceallachain had attacked the Daoise, in what was essentially an affront to Murtough. Ceallachain needed to be taught a lesson, and no better man than Murtough. In 941, Murtough decided he was going to punish Ceallachain for attacking the Daoise after they had submitted to Murtough. Normally, medieval warfare drew to a close in winter. You can just imagine the logistical nightmare of moving large numbers of warriors in wet, windy weather along muddy tracks. However, as winter approached in 941, Murtough defied military convention and gathered the various families of the north and selected 1,000 warriors who were about to embark on a major mission. They donned heavy leather cloaks to protect them from the weather. This would give Murtough his name in history, Murtough of the Leather Cloaks, and they set off to break remaining opposition to the O'Neill and teach Ceallachain a lesson at the same time. When this army turned up in enemy kingdoms, it must have really stunned people. You can just imagine this army appearing out of the mist and rain, covered in heavy leather cloaks. It's no wonder they faced little opposition as they moved through Dublin and Leinster, Munster and Connacht. When they arrived back in Aileach, home of the Cnéalón, there was little doubt in Ceallachain's mind who was in control, because he was with Murtough after being taken hostage. The O'Neills, and Murtough in particular, were all powerful. Not only was Ceallachain being held hostage, but also the King of Leinster and Blaker, the King of the Vikings at Dublin. The major question now was not who was the most powerful kingdom in Ireland. That was unquestionably the O'Neills. But who was the real king of the O'Neills? Technically speaking, it was Donogh. He was High King. But it's been a while since his name has cropped up. Murtough had just defeated the O'Neill enemies on his own with a Northern O'Neill army. He also held the King of Munster, the King of Dublin and the King of Leinster in Aileach, his kingdom. This created an uneasy situation. Donogh must have looked on nervously. Could he really tolerate such a rise in Murtough's personal power? But did he dare do anything about it? Ultimately, it didn't come to this. In reality, everyone knew Murtough was the most powerful. But he seemed happy to wait for Donogh's death to succeed him, so he passed the hostages over after a few months and avoided any confrontation. For these kings, being passed over to Donogh, the future was bleak. O'Neill power seemed to be all-encompassing, and things would surely only get worse for them when Donogh died and Murtough became High King. For Murtough himself, things looked pretty good. Year by year, Donogh was becoming more irrelevant, and even though Donogh was High King, Murtough was able to dictate the direction of the expansion of the O'Neill kingdom, which would all fall to him anyway when Donogh died. He still faced major enemies in Ireland. The Viking settlements were never easy to subdue. And, illustrating this point, in 943, the Dublin Vikings, showing their bravery, verging on the stupidity, attacked the Northern O'Neill in a raid on Armagh. Murtough and his army moved to head them off in modern-day County Louth. As this army, who had defeated all before them, faced the Vikings down, they were unexpectedly routed, and Murtough was killed. In a way, this was inevitable. For a man who had spent his entire life fighting, someday his luck had to run out. The Annals of Ulster aptly eulogised this great hero of early 10th century Ireland as the Hector of the West, in reference to the hero of Troy. Classical analogies were of little use to Murtough's family, the Cnéalón. Murtough's death spelled disaster. How could they replace such a man? In reality, Murtough was irreplaceable, and the authority and prestige he had carved out for the Cnéalón started to fall apart. Although no one could possibly have seen it at the time, the O'Neills probably reached a zenith in power in 941, when Murtough had completed his circuit of Ireland. No other O'Neill High King would surpass this power, although they would see a temporary resurgence in power towards the end of the 10th century. The O'Neills were beginning a long, slow decline. In 943, Murtough's family, the Cnéalón, must have been in a state of collective shock and stress. In a certain way, they must have felt cursed. This was the second time this had happened, that a charismatic Cnéalón king had been killed early on in his career. Only 24 years earlier, Murtough's father Niall Grundov had been cut down in similar circumstances before he could make his mark. I guess this was a cruel irony for a family who produced such great military leaders. Their hopes of becoming the dominant family in the country were dashed in the aftermath of Murtough's death, but their misfortune was only beginning. As you can imagine, uncertainty spread through the Northern O'Neill kingdom on Murtough's death, and in a society like Gaelic Ireland, this must have been frightening, as anyone with ambition started to sharpen their swords, preparing to take advantage of the situation. Although Murtough's brother, Muel Runig, did become king, this didn't resolve the situation. In the northwest, a man called Rory O'Connon was watching the situation closely. He was king of the Connell Conall, a family who had long been excluded from power within the Northern O'Neills by Murtough and his family. This presumably bred resentment and jealousy, and in the chaos that ensued after Murtough's death, Rory took vengeance for 200 years of playing second fiddle to Murtough and his family. He picked his moment carefully and struck at the Canailone when they were attempting to reorganise themselves. He killed Maelrunig and seized the kingship. For Rory this must have been a great moment. You can just imagine he was probably raised on stories about how his forefathers had once dominated the Northern O'Neills, and now, after 200 years, he had finally retaken the kingship. This was a major moment in Gaelic Ireland. For nearly 200 years, the same group of rival families had dominated the Northern O'Neill kingdom and the Southern O'Neill kingdom, and a similar pattern was reflected in other kingdoms around the country. Rory was the first to break this stranglehold, but he was symptomatic of what was coming down the line in the future. His seizure of the kingship of the Northern O'Neills was just the start of a trend which would see dynasties challenge the old orders. Soon Donogha's family, the Clan Coleman, in the Southern O'Neills, would face a similar challenge, while, in time, even the ancient power of Munster, the O'Gornacht, would see their position challenged. The winds of change were clearly blowing. In 944, Donogha Dun Mac Flann, High King of the O'Neills, died. He had achieved very little in his reign as High King. In spite of his poor leadership, he had miraculously ruled for 25 years. His long reign was largely down to the missed opportunity and misfortune of others, particularly Murtough. Medieval chroniclers seem to have had a pretty low opinion of him too. He only gets a one-line obituary in the Annals of Ulster, which is pretty unusual for an O'Neill High King, and he's completely excluded from a list of High Kings in a historical text called the Prophecy of Bearacon. The Prophecy of Bearacon is a strange history of Ireland and Scotland, which is written as if it's a prophecy from the 6th century, when it was really written in the later medieval period. After Donogha's death, confusion reigned, and this was a dangerous situation for Donogha's family. Donogha's family, the Clan Coleman, had dominated the Southern O'Neill kingdom for centuries, and this bred resentment. Many of those excluded families saw Donogha's death not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to end Clan Coleman control. Ironically, it was two families who had once been allies of Donogha who would make the greatest gains from his death. Donogha, through his reign, had developed a series of alliances with minor kings throughout the island. One such alliance had seen Donogha have his sister married off to a man called Muel Muehig from Brega. The son of this marriage was a man called Congolach Cnugba, and he would go on to cause untold problems for Donogha's family. Although Congolach was technically Donogha's nephew, this wasn't the close relationship we would take it to be. Donogha would have had dozens of very similar relations, and in a highly patriarchal society, Congolach would have inherited very little rights to power or connection to Donogha through his mother. However, Gaelic Ireland was changing, and Congolach would not let minor details hold him back. In the weeks after Donogha died, Congolach acted quickly and decisively killed Donogha's own son and heir, and Congolach became king of the Southern O'Neills. Almost overnight, he had ended 2 centuries of Donogha's family's rule over the Southern O'Neill kingdom. The world of the O'Neills was in complete change. New families had emerged in both the Northern and Southern kingdom, but this created a huge problem. How could these two new families, who had risen to power, figure out who was High King? There was no tradition or custom between these two families. This meant one thing, and I'm sure you're guessing what it is: war. For the majority of people, the peasants, the slaves, nearly all women, this just spelled disaster. Their lives weren't going to change, no matter who became High King. All it meant for them was increased misery and turmoil if they had the misfortune to be caught up in a civil war that was going to consume the O'Neills for nearly a decade. Uncertainty was also brewing outside the O'Neill kingdom. In the south, in Munster, a man given a boost by an alliance with Donogha was starting to chip away at the old power in Munster, the Oganacht. In the 930s, the Oganacht had started to reorganise under the king we met earlier, Ceallachain. In response to this, Donogh had supported a minor family in Munster, known as the Dalcash, led by a man called Kennethig mac Lorcan. Donogh hoped that through his support of Kennethig and the Dalcash, this would keep the Oganacht busy and stop any major force arising in Munster. But how wrong he was. This Kennethig mac Lorcan would begin the rise of the Dalcash, who in time would become one of the great rivals of the O'Neills. Donogh should have realised that this Kennethig was no ordinary man. From the little we know of him, his drive and ambition were insatiable. One man who could see the threat he posed, though, was the King of Munster, Ceallachain. Once Donogh died and Kennethig lost his powerful ally, Ceallachain decided he would teach this aspirational king a lesson. Kennethig mac Lorcan and the Dalcash were clearly becoming a force to be reckoned with, and for Ceallachain, who was the King of Munster, this was intolerable. He came from a long line of Oganacht kings that stretched back centuries, while this upstart, Kennethig mac Lorcan of the Dalcash, had a royal lineage that stretched back all of 5 minutes. In a battle fought at Gurthruhacán, Ceallachain did successfully defeat Kennethig, but the setback was only temporary. The cat was out of the bag, and nothing would stop the rise of Kennethig mac Lorcan and his family, and in particular a son called Brian, known to history as Brian Boru, who was only a 3-year-old boy when Ceallachain defeated Kennethig in 944. In the short term, there was a major conflict on the horizon over the kingship of Munster. Ireland faced an uncertain future. In the north, the O'Neills were in crisis. 2 new rulers of the northern and southern O'Neills, Rory O'Connanan and Congolach Cnugba, were about to go to war. Meanwhile, at Dublin, the Vikings, under their first Christian king, Anlov Cuarán, refocused their energies on Ireland. Uncertain times certainly lay ahead. Tune in next time to see what happens. Until then, Slán, and don't forget to keep your feedback coming to history@irishhistorypodcast.ie.